We can do it. So there'll be a quiz at the end on the first verse of 1 Corinthians 12. No pew Bibles. Just kidding. When I read one of Paul's letters, because 1 Corinthians is one of Paul's letters, sometimes I get this guilty feeling that I'm snooping as I read mail that wasn't meant for me, but was meant for someone else. Often mail that is downright unflattering to the recipient. Paul didn't do a lot of letters to people who were succeeding. He liked to send letters to people who had screwed up. So when we read mail written by Paul, we're often getting an inside look into some unflattering business in the church. But the truth of the matter is that this is exactly what we do when we read anything written by Paul. Because they are all that. They're letters and correspondence that were written to individuals and groups of people who are not us, whose troubles are not ours, and whose letters address different issues than our own issues. Issues that often involve big and embarrassing problems in the early church. Now, of course, reading Paul's letters is a little different than reading your neighbor's mail. That is definitely illegal in the United States to open mail that's not for you. But it is a Christian tradition, right? We've canonized these letters. We've decided that somehow the letters that Paul wrote to individual people have a bearing for our lives. We've decided that we're going to just ignore the fact that these letters were written to some people in Corinth, which I'm going to guess lots of us wouldn't know where Corinth was on a map, much less maybe knew what was going on in Corinth at the time that Paul was writing. But we decided that that's a valuable exercise to read these letters from Paul, that we can learn something about ourselves when we crack out ancient letters and read them as though they were intended for us. It reminds me, and I'm going to embarrass myself here because this is a really corny joke. This reminds me of a story that I heard thanks to Kathy Luton on a CD she gave me by this Christian comedian lady, and she told this story, which you can find on the internet pretty easy actually. And it's a story about a man who goes on a trip to Florida, and he's usually from some very cold place, like Duluth. Let's just pick somewhere really cold. Maybe here in February. And his wife is supposed to follow him on a plane the next day because she had work or something. For whatever reason, they couldn't take the same plane. So he decides to send her an email when he gets to Florida to let her know that he's arrived safely and he's waiting for her to get there. Unfortunately, in this story, he sends the email to the wrong address. He puts the wrong email address in the line, and he sends it to a complete stranger. And this stranger just unfortunately happens to be a woman whose husband died the day before. So this woman opens her email and reads this note and faints. And her family runs in because they hear the noise and they don't know what has happened. They see her on the floor, they're like, oh no, this is bad. And they look at the computer and they see the following note. It says, "Hi honey, I just arrived and got checked in. I noticed everything's been prepared for your arrival tomorrow. Looking forward to seeing you then. Love, your husband. P.S. It sure is hot down here." Now, it's a silly joke, but it's funny, I know. Some of the versions have it that it's a minister who just died. Those are kind of funny too. Now, I hope that reading Paul doesn't leave us fainted on the ground, expecting hell tomorrow. But the truth is that when we read Paul and find insight from him, we are effectively gaining truth from beyond the grave. And it certainly helps if we remember the context in which Paul spoke, even if the message is timeless. I imagine that widow, for example, might have reacted a little less extremely if she had noticed who the email was from. If she had noticed the person who sent it, she might have said, "This email isn't for me. I don't know who George is. My husband's name was Frank." She might even have been a little less freaked out if she had known the context, if she had known that this was a guy sending a letter to his living wife, who was also alive, and he had sent it to the wrong address. This would have helped her a lot. She would not have been worrying about dying the next day. So this detective work helps when we read Paul, and because it is true that our world has changed a lot in the last 2,000 years, and our concerns or problems are sometimes very different from those to whom the letter was first written. I'm going to give you a little context on Paul so we can understand a little bit of what he's talking about in 1 Corinthians. So the first thing that I want to share is that this is written to a community. We're used to receiving personal letters, right? We get letters, we read them quietly, sort of figure out what they mean, and then we put them in the appropriate box. This was a letter that was meant to be read like a sermon. So as unflattering as it is, this letter was written to a group of people and was probably read out loud. So you can imagine that whoever these so-called important people were that were preferencing certain gifts over others were probably very embarrassed when this letter was written, but that was how it was intended. Paul wrote to be heard, not to be read. Secondly, it was written to people who were not Jewish and were not familiar with the Jewish origins of Christ. So they were completely unfamiliar with the entire background of Christ's coming to this earth. They didn't know much about the prophets. They didn't have any reason to believe in the law of Moses. They were Gentiles. Furthermore, they were Gentiles living in the city of Corinth, which was a seaport city, which meant that there was a lot of sort of cultural diversity in this town because they had a lot of commerce coming in and out. So Corinth was a town that had a lot of religious influence from different religions. So you would see, it's sort of like today how it's, in most places you can have exposure to a whole lot of other religions, right, other than your own. These were people who had that exposure and had seen lots of other religions in their midst. And since they were unfamiliar with Judaism, Paul had to explain Christ in terms other than the prophets. The third thing is that the scripture, as we may have noticed already, addresses a division within the church in Corinth. It's a division that had arisen over a number of issues. There are a whole lot of issues in this very long letter. Can't imagine how long it took to read. But one of the issues that we read about today was the prioritizing of certain spiritual gifts over others. The result was that there were people in this church who had been treating some individuals as more valuable to the church, more powerful and influential than others, based on what they had to offer. There was sort of a criterion. If you had this to offer, we wanted you around more than if you had this to offer. Specifically, in this community, the individuals that were receiving higher honor were those who could speak in tongues. This was considered the ultimate form of spiritual gift, and those without this gift were being treated as less important and less dignified in the faith community. Now, if we read Paul, we get the sense very quickly that Paul thinks this is a problem. He writes what must have been this very long letter, and most of the letter deals with the issue of division in the church. He spends most of the letter's time and effort reminding the people of Corinth that the end of faith is unity, both with God and with one another. And he does this in a few ways. First of all, he reminds the people of Corinth that it is the Spirit that empowers all people, not just those with popular gifts. He says, there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are varieties of services, but the same Lord. There are varieties of activities, but the same God who activates them in everyone. In other words, the many gifts that we bring to worship all have their source in the Trinity, in the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. That is the only place that gifts come from. And so we're united in the source of our gifts. Secondly, he emphasizes the characteristics of these gifts. He